They say silence can be heavier than words. Sometimes it's not anger or fear behind that silence. It's dignity. This is the story of a Marine who carried his battles alone, who spoke little but whose actions once saved lives. Years later, that same silence nearly condemned him, until a truth long buried walked into a courtroom and changed everything. Tonight, I want to share with you a story of honor, justice, and recognition, a story that reminds us how easily we can mistake quiet strength for danger. If you believe heroes should never be forgotten, stay with me until the end. And don't forget to follow, like, and leave a comment to share your thoughts. The ceiling fan hummed with a lazy rhythm, stirring the heavy courtroom air. Dust drifted in its slow spin, caught by the morning light pressing through narrow windows. Wooden pews creaked beneath the weight of restless bodies, townsfolk curious to witness another small-town trial. I sat at my desk, pen poised, the oak surface cool beneath trembling fingers. After 6 years as a clerk, I thought I had grown immune to the parade of broken families, petty thieves, and men too drunk to know better. But that morning was different. The defendant shuffled in, shackled like a relic dragged from another age. His wrists were bound, his waist cinched by a thick chain that clinked against the bench as the bailiff guided him forward. Daniel Riggs, that was the name typed plainly on the docket. Nothing else but his age, 66, and the mark of a retired Marine. He didn't glance at the gallery, didn't look toward the jury. His eyes were set straight ahead, fixed on some invisible point, as if he had already walked this path 100 times before. He looked the part of the rumors that swirled around him. Weathered face carved by time, a sharp scar trailing across his jaw like a jagged reminder of another life. His clothes were plain, faded jeans and a canvas shirt, worn like a uniform of solitude. His boots scuffed, his posture upright, but his expression wasn't anger. It wasn't fear either. It was something heavier, finality. Not defeat, but the look of a man who had nothing left to prove, nothing left to explain. The whispering had begun long before the judge entered. I caught snatches of speculation from the gallery. "That's the guy from the gas station, right?" One voice hissed. "He threatened to shoot a man from 800 yards. Another muttered about PTSD, about a Marine who'd finally snapped. And I, listening quietly, found myself believing it at first. He looked like someone who had seen too much, someone who hadn't come back all the way. The judge entered and we all rose. She gave her curt nod, settling into her chair. The prosecutor wasted no time. He strode forward, crisp suit swaying with each step, eager to paint Riggs as a menace. His words rang out with theatrical cadence. This man may have worn the uniform, but that was long ago. Intimidation is not patriotism. He gestured dramatically toward the jury, each syllable weighted with intent. The charge itself sounded small, almost trivial. A verbal confrontation at a gas station. No weapon drawn, no one harmed. But the words, "I can take you out from 800 yards, carried a gravity that clung to every juror. From the mouth of a Marine sniper, the phrase became more than bluster. It became fear. The store clerk offered vague testimony, describing Riggs as quiet but intense. A woman claimed she overheard him muttering about killing, though her memory faltered under questioning. No video evidence, no recordings, only scattered words carried by gossip. Yet in the prosecutor's hands, those words became sharp blades, slicing through silence. The public defender sat slouched, papers in disarray, voice dull when she finally rose to speak. Her defense lacked fire, and I could see the jury's eyes sliding past her, already convinced by the spectacle delivered minutes before. She didn't fight for Riggs. No family rose from the gallery to defend him. No character witnesses spoke of who he had been. He was utterly alone at that table, save for the chain that bound him. And yet, what unsettled me most was not his isolation, but his stillness. He never interrupted, never protested. He didn't glare or plead. He sat there as if he'd expected this outcome all along. His silence wasn't surrender. It was armor, though I didn't yet understand what kind. The jury shifted in their seats, glancing at one another with that nervous half-recognition that justice was about to be decided, whether or not truth had been found. The judge gave her instructions, her voice firm, practiced, devoid of warmth. The jurors rose and filed out, the air thick with anticipation. The bailiff removed Riggs's cuffs briefly, a small courtesy, but the chain at his waist stayed locked. The metal clinked when he shifted slightly, the sound slicing through the hush. I stared at him, really stared, for the first time. His eyes weren't wild, weren't broken. They were calm, steady, like still water after a storm. He wasn't the danger painted by the prosecutor. He was something else, though I couldn't name it then. Around me, phones buzzed softly. A reporter typed frantically, chasing the story of a dangerous old Marine on trial. Locals whispered, some shaking their heads, others leaning forward as if waiting for a spectacle. For most of them, this was another case, a tired old man with a grudge against the world. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the verdict, whenever it came, wouldn't be the most important moment in that room. Something was coming. I felt it like a low tremor beneath my feet, like the pressure in the air before a storm. Riggs sat unmoving, eyes fixed forward, as though he too waited for something unseen. The door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. At first, no one turned. Doors opened often, late reporters, clerks returning from lunch. But the silence that followed was different. It swept through the room like a slow tide, pressing down on every chest, holding every breath hostage. I lifted my eyes and saw him, tall, straight-backed, his uniform immaculate, deep navy blue trimmed with silver, 4 stars gleaming on each shoulder. Not the kind you bought at a surplus store. These were earned, lived, carried. A 4-star general stood in the doorway, his presence filling the room before his boots even touched the floor. The judge froze mid-sentence. The jury, just beginning to return, stopped in their tracks, mouths parted in stunned silence. The prosecutor blinked, his face caught between disbelief and panic. I had never seen a room so still. The general's steps were measured, soft, but they commanded the air. Not stomps, not thuds, but whispers of authority woven into each movement. He wasn't searching for where to go. He already knew. His gaze cut straight toward the defense table, straight to Riggs. And for the first time that day, Daniel Riggs moved. Just slightly, a lift of the chin. Their eyes met across the courtroom. No smile, no nod, but something passed between them, silent and unshakable. Recognition. Brotherhood. The general stopped at the table, hands clasped behind his back. The judge rose slowly, her voice cautious, her throat tight. "General, may I ask your business in this courtroom?" The man turned respectfully, his voice steady, deep, carrying through the room without force. "Your Honor, I am here on behalf of the man seated before you." His words struck like thunder in silence. Every head turned, every breath held. The jurors exchanged uncertain glances. I saw a woman in the gallery press a hand to her chest, her lips parted, as though she had just remembered how to pray. The courtroom, moments ago convinced of guilt, now shifted on its axis. What was unfolding wasn't written in the docket, wasn't prepared in the prosecutor's notes. This wasn't another petty trial, this was something else entirely. And in that instant, we all knew. The story of Daniel Riggs was only just beginning. The silence that followed his declaration was unlike anything I had ever felt inside those 4 red brick walls. It wasn't the silence of a jury weighing a verdict, nor the hush that comes when a judge strikes her gavel. It was something deeper, heavier, a recognition that the balance of the entire trial had shifted in a single breath. The general's presence alone was enough to command obedience. But when he spoke, his words carried the weight of history. He gestured toward the defendant's table without once breaking his disciplined posture. "This court may not know the full name of the man seated before you," he began, his voice even, calm, yet resonant. "But I do. Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Riggs, retired, United States Marine Corps, former sniper, Task Force Iron Dagger." A ripple moved through the room. A juror leaned back sharply in her chair, while another exchanged a quick glance with his neighbor. I could see the prosecutor's jaw tighten, his papers rattling in one hand. The general's words weren't bombast. They were precise, measured, like every bullet Riggs had ever fired. Wyatt, yes, that was the name, whispered from the gallery, stood with his back straight, his chin level. 31 years ago, outside the city of Fallujah, My unit was pinned down. 7 Marines, 2 already wounded, our radio dead. Nightfall was coming. The enemy had our position surrounded. His eyes flickered with memory, but his voice did not falter. I was a young major then, green, barely 30. I thought we were finished. You could have heard a pin drop. Even the creak of the pews stilled, as if the wood itself listened. But then came the shots, Wyatt continued. Not cases, not panic, precision. One by one, 12 enemy combatants dropped. Every single shot placed cleanly, no wasted movement, no chance of crossfire. When the dust settled, we were alive. All of us, because of one man. He turned then, not to the judge, not to the jury, but to Riggs, that man. The effect was electric. The air shifted again. The courtroom transformed from a place of judgment into a theater of revelation. Riggs did not move. He simply lifted his eyes, acknowledging the general's words with that same quiet stillness, as though confirmation needed no speech. But Wyatt wasn't finished. He stepped aside slightly, raising one hand, a gesture toward the man who had entered with him. A civilian, middle-aged, wearing a worn flannel shirt tucked loosely into jeans, scuffed shoes betraying years of use. His hair was streaked with gray, his face lined but honest. This is Matthew Dunley, Wyatt said. He was present the day of the gas station incident. The room stirred again. The same incident that had brought Riggs here, the same words that had painted him as a threat, were suddenly about to be re-examined. The prosecutor swallowed hard, his lips tightening into a thin line. Matthew stepped forward, unfolding a small piece of paper in his hand, though he did not glance at it once. His voice was steady, stronger than I expected from a man untrained in courts. My name's Matt, he said simply. I was 2 pumps over when it happened. I gave a statement that day, but I guess it never made it to the right people. He glanced toward the prosecutor, then fixed his gaze on the jury. I saw the whole thing. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle before continuing. The man who claimed he was threatened? He was the one doing the yelling. He shoved Mr. Riggs first, called him a washed-up psycho, said people like him were dangerous. Riggs didn't raise a hand, didn't even raise his voice. He just stood there, calm, quiet, like always. Gasps fluttered through the gallery. I could feel my own pulse quicken, my pen hovering useless above the page. Matthew's jaw tightened as he went on. That line about 800 yards? That didn't come from Riggs. It came from the kid, mocking him. He said it sarcastically, trying to sound tough. I was close enough to hear the tone. It was mocking, not threatening. A woman on the jury covered her mouth with one hand, eyes wide. Another juror leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching Matthew with absolute focus. The prosecutor's knuckles whitened as he gripped his notes. The judge leaned forward, adjusting her glasses slowly, her tone softer than I had ever heard in that courtroom. And Mr. Riggs, did he respond in any way? Matthew shook his head. No, ma'am. He just looked at the man, said, I'm done here, and walked away. That was the moment the floor seemed to tilt beneath us. The entire narrative, carefully built on shaky testimony and hearsay, was crumbling before our eyes. What had been painted as intimidation was being revealed as restraint. What had been called a threat was in truth a provocation turned inside out. General Wyatt stepped forward once more. His eyes scanned the jury, then the judge. With your permission, Your Honor, I would like to submit a sworn affidavit from the gas station manager and security footage recovered yesterday. The judge nodded, her expression one of controlled astonishment. Permission granted. Wyatt inclined his head respectfully, then turned back to the defense table. This court deserves the truth, and this man, he said, gesturing to Riggs, deserves more than silence. The room erupted into whispers, murmurs, darting from one side to the other. The bailiff barked for order, his voice cracking above the commotion. But nothing could silence the storm building in that courtroom. Not after what we had just heard. I glanced at Riggs again. He had not moved. Not a flinch, not a flicker of surprise. His silence was unbroken, but now it was not resignation. It was dignity. It was patience. It was the silence of a man who had waited too long for someone else to finally speak the truth aloud. For years, perhaps decades, Riggs had carried the weight of solitude. the burden of battles fought far from home, of sacrifices never acknowledged. And now, in this unlikely courtroom, with a general at his side and a civilian witness standing firm, the truth had begun to surface. I felt the hair on my arms rise. This was no longer the trial of a bitter old Marine. This was the unveiling of a man who had carried silence as both shield and sentence. And for the first time, I understood. This was not a case about threats. It was a case about recognition. The prosecutor sat frozen, his performance crumbling. The jury leaned forward, caught between disbelief and revelation. The judge remained still, though her eyes told a story of their own, one of shifting perspective, of a heart grappling with the weight of justice. And Daniel Riggs, seated quietly at his table, lifted his chin again, meeting the general's gaze with that same unspoken acknowledgement. Something had changed. The tide had turned. The man they thought they knew was no longer the man before them. And for the first time, I realized the truth was no longer chained. It had just walked through the door. The courtroom seemed suspended in a fragile balance, as though one wrong breath might shatter it. Matthew Dunley stepped back from the jury box, his folded paper still clutched tightly in his hand, though he hadn't once looked at it. His testimony had struck deeper than any legal argument could. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't clever. It was raw, direct, and true. The judge's gavel rested untouched. Her fingers curled loosely around its handle, as though even she knew order had been replaced by something weightier. The jury stared forward, faces pale with realization. For days they had been told a story of intimidation, of an old Marine whose silence was painted as menace. Now they were hearing another story, one that recast silence not as guilt, but as restraint. Wyatt, the general, nodded once to Matthew before turning back toward the judge. He spoke with measured authority, his tone steady but edged with conviction. Your Honor, with the court's leave, we will present the recovered security footage. The bailiff carried a flash drive to the bench, then slid it into the courtroom monitor. The screen blinked to life with grainy footage, the fisheye distortion of a gas station camera. At first it looked ordinary, cars lined at the pumps, figures moving casually. Then the frame settled on two men, the younger one in a tan jacket, messy hair falling across his forehead, his movements quick and sharp. Riggs stood opposite him, shoulders square, hands resting loosely at his sides. There was no sound, but none was needed. The body language screamed louder than any words. The young man leaned forward aggressively, jabbing a finger into the air, stepping into Riggs's space with chest puffed like a challenge. He shoved him lightly at one point, the motion clear even in the blurred frame. Riggs did not react. He stood, unmoving, his weight evenly balanced, his face unreadable. The clip continued. The young man's gestures grew broader, mocking, exaggerated. And then, at the end, Riggs turned, slow and deliberate, and walked away. No lunge, no raised fists, no threats, only stillness followed by retreat. The moment the footage ended, silence returned, heavier than before. One juror pressed a hand to her mouth. Another leaned back, whispering something sharp to himself under his breath. A third leaned forward, staring at the blank monitor as if trying to replay the footage again in his mind. The prosecutor's papers slipped from his hand and scattered across the table. He reached for them but didn't gather them. His lips parted, but no words formed. The arguments he had built, the fear he had woven into narrative, had collapsed in the span of a few minutes. Wyatt moved again, not with flourish but with purpose. He stopped just short of the defense table, his hands clasped neatly behind his back. His gaze swept the jury, the gallery, the judge. And then, in a gesture so quiet yet so thunderous, he dropped to one knee before Daniel Riggs. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. No one moved. It was not weakness in the gesture, but reverence. Wyatt bowed his head, his voice low but unyielding. I am sorry, he said. I am sorry for today, for every day since Fallujah, for every sidewalk where you were passed by without recognition, for every job you were denied, for every whisper behind your back, for every time this country chose not to see you. I am sorry we did not stand up for you sooner. For the first time since the trial began, Riggs moved more than a fraction. Slowly, deliberately, he rose from his chair, his left hand pressed lightly against the table for balance, his right hand reaching out, not to lift Wyatt, not to stop him, but to rest gently on the general's shoulder. It was an acknowledgement, quiet but absolute. Then it came, the faintest curve of his lips, a smile so small it might have been missed. But in that room it was monumental. For a man who had worn silence like armor for years, that simple expression carried the force of 1,000 words. Wyatt lifted his head and Riggs extended his hand. They shook, not as prisoner and general, but as soldiers, as brothers. The moment froze in the air like sacred ground, untouchable. The judge's voice trembled slightly when she finally spoke. In light of new evidence, this court hereby dismisses all charges against Mr. Daniel Riggs. She paused, her tone softening, changing. And on behalf of this bench, I extend a formal apology for the failure of due process. Her words landed not as a verdict, but as healing, reaching across decades of neglect and misunderstanding. The bailiff stepped forward, fumbling briefly with the keys. The chain around Riggs's waist loosened, then fell with a muted clink against the floor. The sound echoed in the stillness, final and liberating. No one clapped, no one cheered. Applause would have desecrated the gravity of the moment. Instead, the room remained steeped in reverence. The jury sat frozen, some with hands clasped tight, others with eyes glistening. The gallery watched in silence, their earlier whispers now transformed into awe. I stood at my desk, my fingers trembling against the wood. I had come to this trial believing Riggs was just another name in a long list of cases, just another broken man, consumed by shadows of his past. But now, before my eyes, he had emerged not as a danger, but as proof that silence could be the truest form of strength. When Riggs turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the room, I felt the weight of his stillness settle inside me. It was as though he carried not only his own burden, but the silence of every soldier who had walked home unrecognized. The prosecutor remained seated, pale, lips pressed into a thin line. His performance was over, his words empty against the weight of truth. And Riggs, no longer bound, stood tall, not triumphant, not boastful, but free. His silence had spoken at last, not through his lips, but through those who finally dared to tell his story. The chains lay on the floor, forgotten. But in that quiet courtroom, they were more than discarded metal. They were the final symbol of how far a man could be misunderstood, and how powerfully truth could cut through even the heaviest silence. That day, reverence had found its rightful place, and Daniel Riggs, once judged as a threat, was recognized for what he had always been, a man who chose restraint over violence, dignity over pride, silence over spectacle. And perhaps for the first time in decades, he wasn't carrying that silence alone. The chain had fallen. That faint metallic clink still rang in my ears as if the sound had been etched into the very grain of the courtroom's oak benches. For the first time since this trial began, Daniel Riggs stood untethered, the weight around his waist gone. Yet the way he carried himself, tall and steady, made it clear that those shackles had never truly defined him. The judge's final words lingered in the silence. This court offers a formal apology, and they were not just spoken to him, but to all who had ever stood where he stood, misunderstood, unseen, burdened with the quiet aftermath of service. No one dared move at first. Even the air seemed hesitant, heavy with reverence. Then slowly, as if compelled by something greater than procedure, the jury began to rise. One by one, without signal or order, they stood. Some placed their hands at their sides. Others pressed palms against their hearts. It wasn't applause, wasn't ritual. It was respect, instinctive, undeniable. Riggs did not bow his head, nor did he raise his arms. He simply looked forward, as though acknowledging their gesture with the same quiet dignity that had carried him through decades of silence. The bailiff stepped aside, allowing him passage. Riggs's boots struck the polished floor with steady rhythm as he walked toward the exit. Each step was measured, grounded, unhurried. Behind him, the prosecutor sat motionless, his performance stripped bare. His papers lay scattered like remnants of a crumbling story that could no longer stand. When Riggs reached the door, it opened into a flood of pale winter light, and there, lining the courthouse steps, were dozens waiting for him. They weren't reporters or spectators. They weren't officials summoned for ceremony. They were veterans. Some stood in faded caps marked with campaigns long past. Others bore chestfuls of medals that glinted softly in the cold air. A few had no outward sign of service at all, only the posture, the quiet steadiness that spoke volumes without words. Word had spread. How? No one could say exactly. But they were there, drawn by an unspoken call, by the simple knowledge that this was not just a trial. This was a reckoning. As Riggs stepped into the light, the veterans moved in unison. Dozens of hands lifted to brows. Dozens of salutes rose in silent, perfect symmetry. No command had been given, yet they stood together, bound by something stronger than orders. The sound of boots on stone echoed as Riggs descended the steps. The air was cold, but it did not bite him. Instead, it seemed to clear around him, each breath visible in the crisp morning, mingling with the solemn stillness. I stood just inside the doorway, watching as my chest tightened. My throat burned. For weeks I had thought of him as just another case file, just another old soldier burdened by shadows. But out there, beneath that line of salutes, I saw him as he truly was. Not a threat, not a relic, but light, hidden too long beneath the weight of silence. He did not wave. He did not gesture grandly. When he reached the bottom of the steps, he paused. Turning slightly, he gave the smallest nod. It was enough. That single motion carried gratitude, recognition, and brotherhood all at once. General Wyatt walked beside him, not as savior but as equal. His polished uniform caught the sunlight, but his gaze remained humble, fixed forward, following Riggs's pace. On the other side, Matthew Dunley stepped quietly, his flannel shirt a stark contrast to Wyatt's military regalia. Yet his presence no less important. He too had spoken truth when it mattered. Behind them, a handful of veterans fell into step. No orders, no formation, just purpose. Their footsteps echoed against the pavement, steady and grounded, like a heartbeat carried forward. No cameras flashed, no reporters shouted questions. The silence that accompanied them was not an empty, it was sacred. It was the kind of silence earned by sacrifice, the kind that binds men together in ways the world often forgets to honor. Inside me, something shifted. For years, I had thought my role as a clerk was routine, a job of records and procedures. But in that moment, I was not a clerk. I was a witness to justice that went beyond verdicts and documents, a witness to recognition finally given where it was long overdue. As the group walked further, fading from sight, I found myself reflecting on what justice truly meant. It was not simply about punishment, nor about acquittal. It was about truth, about seeing clearly what had always been there, but had been obscured by fear, ignorance, or neglect. Justice was not the dismissal of charges alone. It was the acknowledgement of a man's worth, of his dignity, of the life he had lived, and the sacrifices he had borne silently. Daniel Riggs had not needed a speech to prove himself. He had not needed to raise his voice or argue his innocence. The truth had spoken for him through the testimony of a general, through the memory of a witness, through the silent reverence of fellow veterans. And in that truth, we all found something we had nearly lost: the ability to honor quietly, to see clearly, to respect without condition. The courthouse doors swung closed behind them, leaving me inside with the lingering echo of footsteps. I sat again at my desk, the oak cool under my trembling hands, and wrote in my notes not just the official record, but the truth as I had seen it. Because some moments cannot be left to silence. For too long, Riggs had been invisible. That day, we finally saw him. And perhaps that is what justice truly is. Not a gavel strike, not a sentence pronounced, but the courage to recognize dignity where the world had failed to look. Sometimes heroes do not demand recognition. Sometimes they walk in silence, carrying their stories like unseen scars. But every so often, the world pauses long enough to notice, to honor, to remember. That morning outside a small courthouse, silence became anthem. And in the unison of raised hands, justice was not only served, it was sanctified.